The air in the subterranean corridors of the Ridge-Runner Keep tasted of crushed iron and sulfur. Heat rolled up from the lower levels in suffocating waves, carrying the scent of boiling underground water. Lyra Sterling walked down the spiraling stone steps, flanked by 4 armed guards, whose chainmail clinked in erratic rhythms. They sweated profusely, their faces flushed under the oppressive geothermal pressure of the Deep-Crucible. Lyra was not sweating. Her breathing remained shallow and meticulously measured, drawing the humid air into her lungs with deliberate calculation. She kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a defensive posture the guards interpreted as the pathetic trembling of a wolfless omega. They did not know she was pressing her forearms against the coarse linen of her tunic to secure the ledger of border trade hidden against her ribs. The thick leather cover of the document felt dense against her skin. It was a physical anchor of truth in a fortress built on administrative lies, a weight she intended to carry to the center of the arena. The descent was dangerously steep. The cavern walls were slick with ancient condensation, the wet limestone weeping streams of warm water that pooled in the stairwell. Lyra did not look at the guards flanking her. She paid no attention to the heavy iron pikes angled toward her spine. Instead, she listened to the architecture of the deep earth. A single drop of mineral water fell from the vaulted ceiling, striking the stone floor with a hollow chime. She counted 1 beat of her own heart. Another heavy drop fell into a puddle. 2 beats. 3. She used the rhythmic dripping of the geothermal condensation as a metronome, synchronizing the sound with the length of her stride to map the geometry of the tunnel. They always said an omega should know her place. Lyra knew exactly where she was. She was 40 paces from the primary steam vent, 60 paces from the southern drainage grate, and precisely 85 paces from the center of the fighting floor. She committed the distances to memory while her escorts muttered insults about her fragile frame. The guards shoved her roughly forward as the narrow corridor widened into the massive steam-filled cavern of the subterranean pit. The sudden expansion of vertical space did nothing to alleviate the crushing heat. Billowing clouds of white vapor drifted low across the ground, obscuring the damp bedrock. The guards stopped at the threshold of the arena, refusing to step onto the treacherous limestone floor. The tallest shoved her between the shoulder blades, forcing her out from the safety of the tunnel and into the open expanse of the geothermal pit. Lyra stumbled but refused to fall. She quickly adjusted her stance, feeling the slick stone shifting beneath the thin soles of her boots. She continued to count her heartbeats, locking the spatial measurements of the cavern into her tactical memory. Every step was raw data. Every breath was a quiet, necessary calculation. She was an archivist, stepping into a highly pressurized laboratory, and the extreme environment was already providing the variables she required to survive. The towering obsidian walls of the amphitheater curved upward, entirely enclosing the pit. High above the drifting steam, rows of wooden stands were packed with the elite members of the Ridge-Runner Pack. Their murmurs blended into a dull, predatory roar that bounced off the cavern ceiling. At the edge of the lowest balcony, standing behind a railing of polished iron, Elder Garrick Thorne raised his hands to demand silence. He wore the heavy velvet robes of the High Council, the fabric looking absurdly pristine against the industrial reality of the geothermal vents below. Garrick leaned over the railing, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the cavern. He pointed a gloved finger down at the lone figure standing in the mist. He did not speak of her long years of service in the High Archives. He did not mention the meticulously organized territorial registries she maintained. Instead, he loudly presented her to the gathered crowd as a biological failure, heavily emphasizing her complete lack of a wolf form. He called her an empty vessel, a broken lineage, a creature too weak to shift and too fragile to survive the natural order of their world. The audience laughed, a harsh, echoing sound that vibrated through the damp air and settled into the wet stone. Lyra remained completely silent. She did not scream a defense. She did not raise her head to look at the councilman's arrogant face. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself to her knees in the center of the arena. The crowd jeered louder at the motion, assuming she was finally submitting to the terror of the impending trial. They could not see the precise calculated way her hands moved. Kneeling on the wet floor, Lyra secretly felt the geological composition of the ground beneath her. This was the mineral-encrusted crucible floor, a surface she had studied in the oldest blueprints of the keep. Her fingers brushed against a thick layer of dissolved dolomite that coated the limestone bedrock. The water seeping up from the thermal vents was highly alkaline, saturated with heavy minerals, just waiting for a catalyst. She pressed her palms flat against the sharp, jagged ridges of the limestone. The wet gravel bit into her skin like shattered teeth. She welcomed the sharp, localized pain, using the tactile sting to anchor her mind and hide the steady rhythm of her breathing. Garrick continued his sweeping monologue, detailing the ancient laws of survival that demanded the weak be purged from the pack's territory. Up in the stands, spectators leaned forward, eager for the violence to begin, completely blind to the reality of the floor they stared at. Down in the mist, Lyra kept her bleeding hands pressed firmly against the wet dolomite. Let them look at a wolfless woman kneeling in defeat. Let them mock her silence. She was busy reading the temperature of the stone, measuring the alkaline density of the water, and preparing the exact thermodynamic equation that would tear the Elder's arrogant world apart. The heavy, sulfur-laced steam filling the Deep-Crucible did not simply dissipate. It was abruptly severed. A sudden, sharp draft of freezing northern wind cut down from the high terraces, bringing with it the distinct clean scent of ozone, crushed pine and cold iron. It was not a loud entrance. There were no ceremonial horns, no heralds barking royal titles into the cavernous, damp amphitheater. But the effect was absolute and immediate. The jeering crowd, whose cruel laughter had just echoed off the mineral-slick limestone walls, choked on their own breath. The sheer atmospheric pressure of the arena fundamentally changed, orienting the entire space around a single point of gravity. Up in the high obsidian pavilion, a commanding space traditionally reserved for the sovereign, but left empty for over a decade during these provincial proceedings. The heavy iron-wrought doors swung open with a deep, structural groan. Alistair Vaughan stepped into the dim, amber light of the viewing box. He wore a long, unadorned coat of dark wool, lacking the heavy gold chains, jeweled pins or ceremonial armor the regional council so desperately favored. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who never had to rush, because the world naturally bent to accommodate his pace. The corrupt council members, caught entirely off guard by the sovereign king's unannounced arrival, scrambled like scattered insects beneath a turned stone. Heavy carved chairs scraped violently against the polished floor. Dozens of heavily decorated elders dropped into desperate, uncoordinated bows, their foreheads pressing painfully against the freezing obsidian in an immediate display of frantic submission. Alistair did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the groveling display, nor did he wave his hand to grant the breathless elders permission to rise. Instead, he walked past the kneeling assembly with quiet indifference, approaching a small, neglected viewing table positioned right at the balcony's sheer edge. From beneath his thick coat, he withdrew a heavy, tightly rolled cylinder of parchment. He spread it across the tabletop, using a pair of rusted iron inkwells, left behind by previous scribes to flatten the curling, weather-beaten edges. The documents were not warrants, treaties, or royal decrees. They were complex, geological blueprints. He leaned over the table, his dark eyes scanning the intricate cross-sections of the cavern's subterranean fault lines. He studied the schematic drawings of the high-pressure steam pipes, his gaze tracking from the drawn lines of the geothermal bypass valve down to the chemical composition logs of the alkaline hydrothermal pools. The most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories had just interrupted a lethal survival trial, and yet he behaved entirely like a quiet scholar, seeking the right lighting in a dusty archive. He traced a gloved finger along a drawn pressure metric on the parchment, comparing the mathematical calculation to the massive rusted iron vents protruding from the cavern walls below. His absolute, unhurried silence left the council kneeling on the freezing floor, paralyzed by the crushing uncertainty of what he knew, what he was verifying, and why he was really there. The silence in the pavilion stretched until it became a physical weight, far heavier than the humid steam pooling in the arena below. Finally, unable to bear the agonizing tension of the unacknowledged bow, Elder Garrick Thorne broke protocol. He rose unsteadily to his feet, his usually smooth, performative confidence entirely shattered by the Sovereign's sudden, calculated presence. Garrick hurried toward the edge of the pavilion, his boots scraping harshly against the polished obsidian tiles. He stopped at a respectful distance from the viewing table, desperately trying to assemble his features into a mask of pious duty and administrative loyalty. His chest heaved with uneven, nervous breaths, entirely at odds with his rehearsed, aristocratic posture. "Your Grace," Garrick began, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual, lacking the booming theatrical authority he had weaponized just moments before. "We did not expect. That is, the Ridge Runner Council is profoundly honored to host the Sovereign. Had we known you were traveling, we would have prepared a proper feast, rather than subjecting you to the ugly necessity of a traditional survival trial." Alistair did not look up from the geological schematic. He simply turned a page, the heavy parchment rustling loudly in the quiet, tense air of the pavilion. The profound lack of response sent a visible tremor of panic through Garrick's frame. The Elder desperately needed the trial to produce deeds. He needed the execution finished, the evidence buried forever, and the arena floor washed clean before the Alpha King could ask a single question about why a low-ranking administrative archivist was being fed to a cave beast. "It is a minor provincial matter, truly," Garrick continued, speaking faster now, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic bid to force the narrative forward. "An issue of pack security, nothing more. An Omega who failed her duties, severely endangering our borders. We are merely following the ancient rites to cleanse the territory of weakness. With your permission, Sovereign, I will signal the herald to open the beast gates. The matter will be concluded in moments, and we can escort you to more comfortable quarters out of this damp heat." As Garrick spoke, his right hand rose to his throat. He wore a high formal collar made of imported crimson silk, a glaring symbol of his immense, heavily embezzled wealth. In his escalating, barely contained terror, the Elder's claws had involuntarily extended, the sharp, yellowed keratin pushing through his manicured fingertips. He began to nervously adjust the collar, pulling at the fabric as if the ambient steam were physically choking him. His sharp claws caught on the delicate silk weave. Snap. A single thread broke, the sound microscopic but distinct in the heavy silence. Garrick did not notice. He pulled at the collar again, his hand shaking slightly, desperately trying to read the unreadable, motionless profile of the man standing beside him. Snap. The sharp keratin snagged again, this time tearing a visible, ragged gouge into the expensive crimson fabric. "It is vital for the morale of the pack that the law is upheld swiftly," Garrick babbled, his breathing growing increasingly shallow, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold draft cutting through the pavilion. His claws dug deeper into his own collar, shredding the silk, pulling out long, frayed red threads that stuck to his sweating, trembling fingers. He was literally tearing his own high-status garments to pieces, completely unaware of his own physical degradation as his panic over the hidden trade ledgers completely consumed his rational mind. Alistair finally stopped tracing the blueprint. He slowly lifted his head, his dark, calm gaze settling not on Garrick's sweating face, but on the ruined, frayed silk hanging in pathetic, ragged ribbons around the elder's neck. "There is no need to rush, Elder Thorn," Alistair said, his voice low, measured, and entirely devoid of heat. "I am quite interested in how this particular trial unfolds." The air in the arena tasted of sulphur and wet ash. It pressed against the skin like a heavy wool blanket, stifling and thick. Through the swirling steam, a small figure hurried across the damp limestone, her head bowed in the posture of absolute servitude. Cora Miller moved with the frantic, invisible grace of a kitchen maid who had spent her entire life avoiding the heavy boots of the elite. She carried a bundle of rough hemp rope, her official task to secure the perimeter markers before the trial commenced. But her true purpose was hidden in the long, ragged sleeve of her grey woolen tunic. When she reached the centre of the cavern, Cora dropped to her knees beside Lyra Sterling. Her hands, red and chapped from years of scrubbing the fortress kettles in freezing water, trembled violently as she pretended to adjust the frayed edge of Lyra's tunic. The noise of the crowd above them was a dull, rhythmic roar, muffled by the dense geothermal fog that clung to the cavern floor. In this brief, pressurized pocket of isolation, the maid leaned close. "Take it," Cora whispered. She angled her wrist, allowing the heavy sleeve to fall back just enough to reveal the dull, pitted metal of a rusty dagger. The handle was wrapped in coarse twine, stained with old grease. It was a butchering knife, likely stolen from the lower larder at great personal risk. For an Omega servant to steal a weapon was an offense punishable by exile to the frozen tundra. The fact that the maid had risked her life to bring this useless piece of iron to the Deep-Crucible spoke of a fierce, desperate loyalty that no council decree could ever command. Lyra looked down at the offering. The metal was cold and chipped, a tool meant for slicing root vegetables and tough meat, not for piercing the thick, armored hide of a subterranean predator. Cora's eyes were wide. They held the specific, suffocating terror of someone who believed they were about to watch their only friend be torn apart. She pushed the hilt toward Lyra's palm, her knuckles white with the strain of her own bravery. Instead of grasping the weapon, Lyra reached out with a steady hand. She did not tremble. Her fingers were stained with ink and chalk dust, calloused from lifting heavy ledgers rather than wielding blades. Very gently, she extended a single index finger and pressed it against the flat of the rusty blade. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pushed the dagger back into the dark folds of the servant's sleeve. "Cold iron is useless against thermodynamic laws, Cora," Lyra murmured. Her tone was perfectly even, carrying the measured cadence of an archivist reading a shipping manifest. She kept her gaze fixed on the maid's frightened face, offering a brief, grounding anchor of sanity in the chaos of the amphitheater. "A blade requires proximity and physical leverage. I possess neither. If I try to stab a beast with a wingspan twice my height, I will simply hand it my center of gravity." Cora blinked. A tear cut a clean line through the soot on her cheek. "But you have nothing else," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "They are going to let it out. You cannot fight it with empty hands." "I am not fighting it," Lyra answered softly. She smoothed the collar of Cora's tunic, a gesture of quiet, protective warmth that momentarily inverted their statuses. "I am going to change the temperature of the room. Go back to the kitchens. Stand near the eastern archway, away from the lower grates, and do not close your eyes." The maid hesitated. Her frantic heartbeat was visible against the thin fabric of her uniform, but the absolute certainty in Lyra's voice forced her to obey. Swallowing hard, Cora tucked the dagger away. She scrambled back toward the service tunnels, melting into the shadows, just as the warning horns blew a second time. Left entirely alone in the center of the vast circular arena, Lyra turned her attention away from the hostile audience. The jeers and laughter raining down from the obsidian pavilion meant nothing. Noise was merely moving air. It had no mass, no structural weight, and no capacity to alter physical reality. She blocked out the council's mockery and focused her senses exclusively on the environment she had carefully mapped in her mind. High above, suspended along the jagged ceiling of the cavern, a network of thick iron pipes groaned under immense pressure. These conduits carried the boiling, pressurized carbon dioxide from the deep volcanic vents, channeling it away from the fortress above. Lyra tracked the alignment of the iron joints. She noted the distinct, high-pitched whistle of steam escaping from the secondary release valves. The sound confirmed her earlier calculations. The pressure inside the primary containment unit was building perfectly, nearing the critical threshold she required. She lowered her gaze to the ground. The mineral-encrusted crucible floor was a masterpiece of subterranean chemistry. Over centuries, the continuous flooding and receding of the alkaline hydrothermal pools had deposited thick layers of dissolved minerals across the uneven limestone. It looked like a field of dirty yellow-white snow, slick and treacherous. To the uneducated eye, it was just a hazardous, slippery surface designed to make the trial more entertaining for the spectators. To Lyra, it was a dormant chemical weapon waiting for a catalyst. She knelt slowly, ignoring the dampness seeping into the knees of her linen trousers. The ground radiated a dull, pulsing heat. Extending her right hand, she dragged her thumb across the ridge of a protruding stone, scraping up a small sample of the white, chalky crust. She brought her thumb to her lips and touched the powder to her tongue. The taste was sharp, bitterly alkaline, and intensely salty. A sharp copper tang flooded her mouth, confirming the high concentration of dissolved dolomite and calcium carbonate in the crust. The saturation levels were exactly as she had predicted when she read the geological survey logs in the archives 3 nights ago. The minerals were unstable, held in a delicate liquid suspension by the ambient heat of the cavern. If the temperature were to drop suddenly, the solubility of the dolomite would plummet, triggering a rapid endothermic precipitation. It would turn the liquid mud into solid stone in a matter of seconds. Lyra wiped her thumb on her tunic and stood up, her posture straight and unbroken. She turned her head slightly to the left, establishing a clear, unobstructed sightline to the heavy iron wheel mounted against the far wall. The geothermal bypass valve. It was an obsolete, manual control lever, ignored by the guards because it had not been used in decades. But earlier that morning, under the cover of delivering the morning inventory ledgers, she had secretly loosened the rusted locking pin and greased the threading with tallow. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the sulphurous air fill her lungs. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. She did not need sharp teeth, heavy claws, or the brute force of a shifting alpha. She had the immutable laws of thermodynamics on her side, and the precise, unyielding mathematics of the earth beneath her feet. All that remained was the timing. Harlan Cross stood at the very edge of the high viewing box, his posture stiff with the performative authority of a man desperate to please the corrupt elders flanking him. He leaned heavily over the carved obsidian railing, holding a heavy brass speaking horn to his lips. His voice boomed across the humid cavern, unnaturally amplified by the heavy condensation and the concave, bowl-like architecture of the enclosed amphitheater. He did not simply speak the ceremonial words of the trial. He weaponized the acoustics of the enclosed space. Each syllable was deliberately drawn out, projected with a vibrating, metallic resonance meant to physically disorient the lone woman standing below. He wanted the noise to bounce violently off the wet limestone walls, to strike the arena floor from every conceivable angle, creating a chaotic wall of sound that would trigger the prey drive of an unshifted Omega. The trial of the Ridge Runner pack commences. Harlan bellowed, the sound tearing through the thick, sulphur-scented steam. The resulting echo was a physical weight, pressing hard against Lyra's eardrums. He dragged out the final syllable, pitching his voice sharply above the sudden, violent grinding of heavy iron gears. At the far end of the cavern, the massive security gates were beginning to lift. The rusted chains screamed as they were pulled through ancient, unoiled winches, producing a deafening mechanical shriek that the herald purposefully tried to drown out with his continuing proclamations. He listed the alleged crimes she was accused of: treason, theft of pack secrets, insubordination, his tone rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence explicitly designed to induce absolute panic. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to start running blindly across the slick stone before the gate even fully opened, exhausting her limited stamina in a blind, instinctual terror while the crowd mocked her frailty. Lyra did not run. She stood perfectly still, her soft leather boots planted firmly on the uneven, mineral-slick stone. She closed her eyes for a single second, systematically filtering out the overwhelming auditory assault. The heavy vibrations rattled the floor beneath her, traveling up through the soles of her feet, but she refused to let the noise command her heartbeat. She mentally separated the booming of the amplified voice from the mechanical grind of the lifting iron. She timed the slow ascent of the gates by counting the metallic clanks of the chain links. 7 links, 8 links. The heavy iron barrier was rising, inch by agonizing inch, revealing the absolute, pitch-black darkness of the holding tunnel beyond. The temperature of the air rushing out from that dark gap was significantly colder than the pressurized, boiling steam of the arena, creating a sudden, swirling draft that pulled sharply at the hem of her simple linen tunic. The herald continued his theatrical roaring, his voice echoing endlessly off the high ceiling, but she had already tuned him out entirely. Her attention was solely focused on the thermal displacement occurring at the base of the opening gate, reading the shifting air currents the way she would read a complex logistical map. From the absolute blackness of the holding tunnel, a massive, horrific shape began to extract itself. The beast did not leap out with the frenzied, chaotic energy of a typical rogue wolf. It crawled. It was a starved, heavily armored cave beast, a creature of the deep subterranean dark, violently thrust into the overwhelming heat and blinding light of the geothermal arena. Its heavy claws, thick and jagged as iron spikes, scraped against the wet limestone, leaving deep, white gouges in the mineral crust. As it pulled its massive bulk forward, the thick, grey armor plating that covered its spine and wide shoulders became starkly visible under the flickering, amber torchlight. It was a biological tank, bred for crushing solid stone and surviving deep earth pressure, not for sustained speed. Lyra Sterling watched the emerging creature with the cold, detached precision of an archivist, reviewing a newly acquired ledger. She did not focus on the rows of jagged, yellowed teeth, nor did she fixate on the hollow, starving sunkenness of its ribs. Her eyes locked exclusively onto the surface of the creature's armor. The holding tunnel behind the beast had been freezing cold, a deliberate, cruel tactic by the Council to starve and agitate the animal before release. Now, as it dragged its cold body into the highly pressurized, steam-filled environment of the cavern, the extreme shift in ambient temperature caused an immediate, visible physical reaction. A thin, glistening layer of condensation was rapidly forming across the entirety of the beast's grey plating. Water droplets beaded and rolled down its spiked spine in heavy rivulets, mixing with the damp sulfur hanging thick in the air. Let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. The creature was cold-blooded, or at least highly dependent on external thermal regulation. The extreme, suffocating heat of the cavern was actively shocking its nervous system, making its initial movements sluggish, heavy, and predictable. Its massive horned head swung slowly from side to side, struggling to process the sudden assault of high temperatures and the deafening echoes of the spectators above. And then, its pale, milky eyes locked onto the solitary figure standing before it. She was the only stationary object in a room full of swirling steam and shifting shadows. The beast let out a low, vibrating hiss that rattled the loose dolomite pebbles near her boots. The condensation on its heavy armor was already beginning to evaporate in the intense heat, a clear physiological signal that the creature's internal temperature was rapidly rising. As it warmed, its temporary sluggishness would vanish, replaced entirely by the lethal, rapid violence of a starving predator. The young woman mentally calculated the exact rate of evaporation. She measured the distance between the beast's heavy front claws and the saturated alkaline pools of the treacherous arena ground, stretching directly between them. She did not reach for a weapon, nor did she adopt a panicked defensive stance. She simply calculated the exact number of seconds she had left before the beast's joints thawed enough to sustain a full-speed charge. The acoustics of the subterranean cavern amplified every sound into a crushing physical pressure. The crowd's reaction crashed against the damp limestone walls, a chaotic, booming wave of bloodlust and mockery. Pack members leaned over the heavy iron railings, their faces flushed in the geothermal heat, screaming for the Omega to run. They demanded the frantic scrambling, the desperate weeping, and the pathetic display of terror that their rigid social hierarchy promised them. To them, a wolfless woman was merely a fragile object placed in the dirt to be broken. In the high obsidian pavilion, elevated above the deafening noise and the rising clouds of sulphurous vapor, Alistair Sorvorn sat in perfect stillness. The sovereign king did not share the frantic energy of the local elites. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. While the regional lords and wealthy merchants gripped the edge of the balcony, their eyes glued to the dark, massive shape charging out of the gates, his attention moved in the opposite direction. He ignored the starved predator entirely. His gaze was locked on the small, solitary figure standing near the edge of the saturated pools. He noted the specific mechanics of her posture. She was not bracing for a physical impact, nor was she scanning the cavern walls for an escape route. Her shoulders were relaxed, her weight evenly distributed on the slippery bedrock, and her breathing remained slow and measured despite the rising temperature. She possessed the still, cold focus of a compass needle finding north. The man leaned forward, the heavy velvet of his cloak shifting with a quiet rustle against the carved basalt chair. He did not move out of alarm, but out of sharp, sudden, analytical interest. He narrowed his dark eyes, cutting through the visual distortion of the humid air, tracing the line of her vision. Then he looked at her right hand. Her fingers were not trembling. They were curled securely around a thin, copper-coated line that ran down her sleeve. The sovereign's gaze followed that metallic thread as it extended away from her, weaving invisibly through the shadows of the jagged stalagmites, rising steadily until it connected directly to the heavy iron mechanism of the geothermal bypass valve mounted high on the southern wall. The king's mind, trained in the brutal logistics of territorial warfare, processed the visual data with ruthless efficiency. He did not see a helpless victim praying for a magical intervention. He saw a complex equation of fluid dynamics and thermodynamic pressure. During his inspection of the territory the previous night, he had reviewed the architectural drafts of the Deep-Crucible. He knew it exactly what ran through those pipes. He understood the lethal concentration of pressurized carbon dioxide waiting behind that rusted iron wheel, and he recognized the deep alkaline saturation of the hydrothermal pools currently bubbling at Lyra's feet. The geometry of the cavern shifted before his eyes, transforming from an execution yard into a brilliantly engineered snare. She had calculated the exact blast radius. She had measured the temperature differential and anchored herself precisely at the apex of the thermal kill zone. This was not the panicked freezing of prey. It was the disciplined waiting of a master tactician who had laid a trap using the very earth her enemies claimed to rule. Alistair Vaughan smiled. It was not a wide or boisterous expression, nor did it carry the cruel amusement typical of the northern warlords. It was a subtle, proud curving of the mouth, a quiet look of absolute, undeniable recognition. It was the smile of a sovereign who had spent his entire reign surrounded by brute force and empty posturing, only to find a peerless strategic intellect standing on a muddy cavern floor, disguised in the frayed, damp linen of a condemned archivist. A few feet away, Garrick Thorne stood rigid near the marble balustrade, his hands gripping the stone as he nervously monitored the king's profile. The corrupt elder's political survival hinged entirely on this spectacle. The trial was designed to be a violent distraction, a public execution to permanently bury the missing financial records before the royal guest could order a formal audit. When Garrick saw the faint curve of the king's mouth, a heavy, suffocating wave of relief washed over his chest. The elder misinterpreted the expression completely. Trapped within his own arrogant, hierarchical worldview, Garrick assumed the sovereign was cut from the same cloth as the local tyrants, a man who enjoyed the visceral entertainment of suffering. He believed the reigning monarch was genuinely pleased by the spectacle, satisfied by the imminent destruction of a weak, useless Omega who had dared to step out of line. His chest swelled with misplaced triumph. He exchanged a quick, smug glance with the nearby herald, convinced that the rigged execution had successfully won favor and secured their illicit empire. Alistair did not spare the elder a single glance. He did not acknowledge the sycophantic murmurs of the council members crowding the pavilion, nor did he respond to the deafening roars of the crowd below. Instead, the man reached slowly toward the stone parapet, his leather-gloved fingers wrapping around the stem of his silver goblet. He picked the vessel up with unhurried, deliberate grace. Without breaking his visual lock on the small figure in the arena, Alistair raised the cup. It was a silent, solitary toast, offered straight through the heavy, drifting mists of the geothermal vents. A gesture of profound respect, delivered in the midst of a slaughterhouse. Down on the slick, mineral-encrusted floor, amidst the vibrating roars of the advancing beast and the deafening jeers of the audience, Lyra Sterling kept her grip steady on the copper wire. The gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth, grounding her in the physical reality of the moment. She did not look at the monster closing the distance. She ignored the screaming elites who wanted her dead. For one fleeting, calculated second, she tilted her chin upward. Through a sudden break in the rolling white steam, she saw the dark, imposing silhouette standing at the edge of the high obsidian box. She saw the raised silver goblet catching the dim subterranean light, a beacon of quiet acknowledgement cutting through the chaos. He knew. The king understood exactly what she was about to do. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The isolation that had defined her entire existence vanished in the space of a single breath. She was not a broken Omega facing death alone in the dark. She was a recognized tactician, and the highest authority in the land was watching her work. Her pulse steadied into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. The trap was set, the audience was blind, and she was merely waiting for the final variable to cross the required threshold. The massive predator did not hesitate. Driven by starvation and the overwhelming heat of the cavern, the armored cave beast launched its colossal weight forward. Its charge was not a clumsy, blind rush, but a terrifying display of apex anatomy, the thick-plated scales along its spine, shifting with brutal efficiency. Each time its heavy front claws struck the ground, the impact sent violent tremors through the damp limestone, vibrating directly up through the thin soles of Lyra's leather boots. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic, bone-rattling thud that echoed off the high obsidian walls and drowned out the frantic jeers of the crowd above. She did not step back. The council elders always claimed a wolfless woman should know her place. Today, her place was exactly here, anchored on a specific, jagged groove carved into the stone. The beast tore across the slick expanse of the pale chemical basin. The ground here was treacherous, heavily layered with dissolved dolomite and slick hydrothermal runoff, but the creature's hooked talons dug deeply into the crust, seeking purchase. A thick wall of displaced steam billowed outward from its charging form, carrying the foul, metallic scent of stagnant water and predatory hunger. The rushing wind of its approach hit the archivist with the force of a physical blow, snapping the loose hem of her tunic against her thighs and whipping stray strands of dark hair violently across her cheeks. Still, the young woman refused to blink. She kept her eyes wide open, forcing her visions to cut through the swirling grey mist and the chaotic blur of motion. She was not looking at the beast's snapping jaws, nor at the rows of serrated teeth that could crush bone in a single bite. Her gaze remained locked downward, fixed with absolute clinical precision on a single, unassuming crack tracing its way across the pale limestone. That fracture marked the outer boundary of the deepest alkaline pool zone. It was the mathematical threshold of her trap, the precise geographic coordinate where the subterranean water table held the highest concentration of dissolved minerals. If she reacted a fraction of a second too early, the predator's momentum would carry it straight through the precipitation field before the trap could close. If she waited a fraction of a second too late, the sheer kinetic force of its heavy skull would shatter her ribs into powder before the chemical reaction could take hold. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for a single miscalculation. The shadow of the beast stretched over the pale rock, elongating as it closed the final 20 yards, 15 yards. 10. The air pressure in the cavern shifted dramatically, sucked the vacuum of the creature's lunging mass. Lyra regulated her breathing, slowing her heart rate by anchoring her mind entirely to the cold, undeniable laws of thermodynamic physics. The monster's silhouette crept closer, inching toward the jagged fault line in the stone. She waited. The heavy, scaled shadow finally eclipsed the crack in the limestone floor. The beast's massive front claws slammed down into the center of the designated alkaline basin, displacing a wave of murky, mineral-rich water. Lyra moved. Her hands, previously hanging loose and relaxed at her sides, snapped upward with practiced, unhesitating speed. Her ink-stained fingers clamped tightly around the rusted iron wheel of the geothermal bypass valve hidden flush against the cavern wall. The metal was brutally cold against her palm, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the arena, but she did not flinch. Bracing her boots against the stone baseboard, she threw her entire body weight backward, pulling the lever and rotating the heavy wheel in one smooth, violent exertion of leverage. Deep beneath the mineral-encrusted crucible floor, a series of ancient high-pressure pipes violently decompressed, screaming against decades of rust and neglect. A concentrated, deafening hiss erupted through the arena as massive volumes of highly pressurized carbon dioxide were suddenly diverted from the industrial exhaust vents directly into the shallow, alkaline hydrothermal pools surrounding the combat zone. The physical chemistry of the chamber altered in a microsecond. The sudden introduction of expanding gas stripped the ambient heat from the immediate environment, triggering a massive endothermic reaction. The temperature of the water plummeted instantly from a boiling simmer to sub-zero. The dissolved dolomite in the pools, supersaturated and unstable, reacted to the extreme thermal shock by precipitating out of the liquid at terrifying speed. A sharp, crackling roar echoed through the cavern, sounding like a winter glacier tearing itself apart under the strain of a heavy storm. The alkaline water did not just freeze into ice, it crystallized into dense, impenetrable mineral stone, expanding outward with geometric precision. The reaction rushed outward in a vicious, jagged wave of white frost and hardening rock. The ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped so violently that the moisture in the air turned into suspended ice. Frost bloomed instantly across her eyelashes, stinging the delicate skin around her eyes. Yet the Omega kept her grip locked on the iron valve, braving the biting physical chill to ensure the pressure remained fully open. Her breath plumed into thick, white clouds mixing with the freezing mist rolling off the newly formed dolomite crust. The predator's momentum was arrested with brutal, mechanical finality. As its heavy claws sank into the rapidly crystallizing pool, the liquid stone hardened around its limbs like an iron vise, locking the beast entirely in place, just inches from where the quiet archivist stood. The hissing of the alkaline pools slowly subsided, replacing the chaotic roar of escaping gas with the quiet, steady dripping of condensation. The dense cloud of pressurized carbon dioxide and hydrothermal steam began to thin, swirling in slow, heavy ribbons against the damp, curved limestone walls of the arena. The air smelled sharp, stinging the back of the throat with a distinct metallic tang of ozone and wet chalk. As the white vapor dissipated into the high arches of the cavern, the shape of the massive cave beast emerged from the atmospheric haze. It was not torn apart. It was not bleeding onto the ancient stone. Instead, it was perfectly, flawlessly immobilized. A thick, opaque crust of precipitated dolomite encased the creature's 4 heavy legs, rising all the way to its armored chest and locking its joints in place. The rapid endothermic reaction had flash-frozen the dissolved minerals, turning the liquid into a solid stone cast within seconds, permanently anchoring the predator to the calcified bedrock. The beast struggled for a brief, panicked second. Its heavy, dark shoulder muscles bunch under the thick keratin plating, attempting to tear free, but the crystalline bonds hold with absolute geometric perfection. The new stone is seamless, an unbreakable mold born from chemical necessity rather than brute physical force. Lyra stands a mere 5 paces away. Her breath remains steady and measured, though the damp, sudden cold radiating from the chemical reaction has chilled her simple linen tunic. She watches the creature carefully. It is shivering, the violent, sudden drop in ambient temperature required to catalyze. The dolomite has shocked its system, draining the heat from its heavy plates. It lets out a soft, confused click from the back of its throat, a sound completely devoid of its former predatory aggression. Without the desperate drive of engineered hunger, it is just an animal, starved, trapped, and manipulated by cruel men. The archivist reaches into the deep pocket of her apron. Her ink-stained fingers brush past a heavy, folded leather binding, the trade ledger, and find a small pouch of dried herbs. She pulls out a tightly bound bundle of suntime and crushed ember root, a highly thermal mixture she normally uses to steep restorative teas during the freezing night shifts in the records room. Moving slowly, so as not to startle the caged animal, she takes one deliberate step forward. She tosses the small bundle with a gentle flick of her wrist. It lands softly on the wet stone, inches from the beast's flared nostrils. The creature flinches, blinking large, disoriented eyes, then sniffs. As the ambient moisture of the arena hits the dried ember root, the plant fibers react, releasing a localized, gentle thermal heat. The shop's spicy scent of the herb cuts cleanly through the alkaline air. The beast's frantic shivering slows as the warmth pools around its snout. It clicks again, softer this time, resting its heavy chin on the edge of the dolomite crust. Lyra does not smile in triumph. She merely watches the animal breathe, her empathy a quiet rebellion against a pack that only valued the tearing of flesh. The Deep-Crucible was architecturally designed to amplify sound. Every desperate scream, every bone breaking against the bedrock, was engineered to echo upward into the obsidian pavilion, so the elite classes could comfortably enjoy the slaughter. Yet in this moment, the acoustics of the great cavern carry nothing but the soft, rhythmic patter of falling water droplets. A stunning, profound silence has fallen over the entire amphitheater. Hundreds of spectators, who had leaned forward to witness the swift, brutal execution of a wolfless omega, sit absolutely frozen in their high wooden tiers. No one cheers, no one speaks. The collective breath of the Ridge Runner pack seems to have been swallowed by the damp stone walls. Up in the grand viewing box, Garrick grips the heavy iron railing overlooking the pit. His knuckles are completely white, the tendons straining against the skin. The arrogant flush of victory has drained entirely from his aristocratic face, leaving his complexion the hollow, bloodless shade of old parchment. He stares down at the arena floor, his mind violently rejecting the visual evidence before him. There is no blood on the limestone. There is no torn clothing scattered across the gravel. The fragile, invisible woman he had condemned to a violent death is standing calmly in the center of the arena, having weaponized the very geology of the cavern into an inescapable cage. Beside the elder, Harlan Cross stands with his mouth hanging slightly open. The herald had spent the entire morning drafting the perfect, legally binding eulogy for the archivist, eager to formalize her death and please his corrupt master. Now, his manicured hands begin to tremble. The realization that their lethal, foolproof trap has failed, and failed without a single display of shifting magic, fangs, or brute force, strikes him with the paralyzing weight of a physical blow. The political implications begin to cascade through his panicked thoughts. In his trembling grip, Harlan holds the heavy silver announcing scroll, the instrument meant to declare the end of the trial. His fingers go slack. The polished metal cylinder slips from his damp palm. It hits the stone and loose dirt of the viewing box floor with a sharp, piercing crack. The cylinder rolls forward, the heavy silver clattering violently against the uneven masonry. In the absolute, breathless quiet of the massive cavern, the sound is deafening. It echoes off the wet walls, a chaotic metallic noise that shatters the paralyzing tension. Every eye in the lower tiers darts upward toward the sound. Garrick does not even flinch at the noise next to him. He remains completely frozen, staring down at his intended victim, realizing with sudden, suffocating clarity that her survival guarantees the survival of the evidence she carries. Down on the arena floor, Lyra hears the rolling silver. She does not look up at the terrified herald, nor does she seek out the corrupt elder who tried to bury her in the dark. Her posture remains perfectly straight, her hands resting quietly at her sides. The scrape of heavy carved wood against polished stone broke the paralysis gripping the high obsidian pavilion. Alistair Vaughan stood. He did not rush. He did not emit the oppressive, suffocating pheromones expected of an alpha king needing to assert immediate dominance over a chaotic room. He simply rose from his high-backed seat, gathering the dark velvet folds of his winter cloak with methodical, unhurried slowness. Beside him, Garrick Thorne finally found his voice. It was a high, panicked sound that fractured the cavern's tense stillness. The elder stepped hastily into the sovereign's path, his ceremonial robes rustling as his hands fluttered in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "My king, the machinery must have malfunctioned." Garrick stammered, sweat beading rapidly across his forehead despite the draft in the pavilion. The Omega clearly tampered with the ventilation grates prior to the trial. It is sabotage, a blatant violation of our sacred traditions. I will have the guards execute her immediately for this treason. Alistair did not stop. He did not even turn his head to acknowledge the elder's frantic existence. He walked directly forward with measured, heavy steps, forcing Garrick to stumble backward into the brass safety railing to avoid being trampled. The sovereign occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology and entirely without the nervous impulse to fill the void. Bypassing the sputtering councilman, Alistair began his descent down the wrought iron spiral staircase that connected the high gallery to the testing yard below. The atmospheric pressure shifted tangibly as he descended. The dry, heavily perfumed air of the royal boxes gave way to the thick, sulphur-laced humidity of the fighting floor. Condensation dripped from the jagged basalt ceiling, each drop echoing like a metronome in the vast, quiet chamber. When Alistair reached the ground level, he paused at the outer edge of the arena. The limestone floor was slick with highly alkaline hydrothermal runoff, creating a treacherous, unstable terrain for any wolf. But bisecting that wet expanse was a brand new geological feature. a stark white ridge of rapidly precipitated dolomite. Rather than walking around the chemical perimeter Lyra had engineered, Alistair stepped directly onto it. He placed his heavy leather boot onto the chalky, crystallized crust. The stone held firm. He shifted his entire weight onto the newly formed mineral cast, testing the structural integrity of her work. It did not crack. It did not buckle. The Alpha King walked the exact path of the chemical safety line, trusting his physical safety entirely to the mathematical precision of a wolfless archivist. Every step he took on that white ridge was a public, undeniable validation of her intellect, his boots echoing loudly across the damp silence of the cavern as he approached the center of the yard. Stopping a few paces from where Lyra stood, Alistair allowed the heavy thermal drafts to pull at the hem of his dark cloak. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The Sovereign's sharp gaze drifted from her perfectly straight posture to the massive armored cave beast lying a few yards away. The predator remained entirely immobilized, beneath a thick, unbroken shell of frozen dolomite, its chest heaving in a steady, uninjured rhythm. The trap had not been designed to kill. It had been designed to neutralize with absolute, clean efficiency. An endothermic reaction of this velocity requires flawless atmospheric calibration, Alistair said. His voice was a low, resonant instrument, devoid of the aggressive posturing the Council so heavily relied upon. It carried effortlessly across the cavern, ensuring every elder in the gallery heard him. A fraction of a degree warmer, and the precipitation would have failed to harden in time. A fraction cooler, and the pressurized carbon dioxide would have shattered the underlying bedrock, collapsing the floor. He knelt slowly, inspecting the clean bonding line where the chemical frost met the beast's dark, armored scales. You calculated the ambient humidity of the Deep-Crucible and used the beast's own kinetic body heat as the final thermal catalyst. Lyra kept her chin level, her breathing slow and controlled. The mineral saturation in the lower pools provided the necessary alkaline base, sire. Alistair straightened, turning his full attention back to her. He did not look at her with the patronizing pity the pack usually reserved for omegas, nor did he look at her with the predatory hunger of a conqueror. He looked at her the way a seasoned tactician looks at a master architect. His eyes dropped to her hands. She had maintained her posture with absolute discipline, but the physical toll of operating the heavy, rusted iron mechanisms remained visible. Her skin was streaked with black industrial grease and copper dust. The sharp gravel of the arena floor had bitten deep into the flesh of her palms when she first braced herself against the grating, leaving raw, abraded impressions across her knuckles. Alistair reached out. He did not issue a command, nor did he seize her wrist to force compliance. He simply offered his open hand in the space between them, a silent request for permission. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second, entirely unused to being approached without the threat of violence, before she slowly uncurled her fingers. He took her cold, soot-stained hand into his own warm grip. The Alpha King turned her palm over under the dim, steam-filtered light of the cavern. He examined the bleeding scrapes and the bruised flesh with deliberate, analytical care. He traced the edge of a jagged scratch near her thumb, applying absolutely no pressure, merely acknowledging the physical cost of her survival. It was not a gesture of ownership or crude dominance. It was a profound, quiet recognition of a warrior's wounds, earned not through fangs or raw biological strength, but through a brilliant, unyielding mind. The heavy, damp air of the Deep-Crucible clung to the thick fabric of her tunic. Lyra did not tremble as she reached beneath the coarse linen, her fingers finding the dense shape she'd had kept, pressed against her ribs for 3 days. She withdrew a tightly bound oilcloth package. Water dripped from the ceiling, but the contents remained perfectly dry. Alistair Vaughan stood entirely still. His power was not the nervous, grasping kind that demanded immediate obedience. It was the stillness of a compass needle finding north. He waited, offering her the silent dignity of presenting her own truth at her own pace. Slowly, Lyra unknotted the waxed twine. The oilcloth fell away, revealing the cracked cover of the ledger of border trade. It smelled faintly of beeswax and the sharp tang of iron gall ink, a scent that belonged to the high archives, far removed from the sulphurous heat of the geothermal arena. She held it out. The sovereign king took the heavy volume with measured care, his leather-clad fingers brushing the scarred edge of the binding. The Ridge Runner Council did not sentence me to the arena because I lack a wolf, she said. Her voice was not loud, but the absolute lack of hesitation carried it. They sentenced me because I read the margins. She stepped to his side, orienting herself not as a prisoner, but as a peer reviewing a tactical map. With a steady hand, she opened the ledger to the middle pages. The parchment was filled with neat columns detailing grain shipments and winter rations. To an untrained eye, it was an ordinary agricultural record. Here, Lyra pointed to the faint notations etched beside the dates. They logged these as seasonal wheat deficits, but the mathematics were flawed. The caloric intake required for the listed livestock did not match the weight of the feed, moving across the border. It was not grain they were importing. I cross-referenced these margins with the historical local taxation logs from the lower library, she continued, her tone holding the precise cadence of a scholar presenting undeniable fact. The dates align exactly with the sudden spikes in rogue attacks along the eastern ridge. The numbers are not deficits, they are breeding weights. They were housing and trading rogue cave beasts, funding their private estates by creating the very security threats they were taxing the pack to defend against. Not magic, not biological destiny. Simply the rigorous paleographic analysis of a woman who had spent a decade ignored in dusty rooms. Alistair looked from the marginalia to her calm face, letting that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone. A profound piece of accounting, the Alpha King murmured. From the elevated stands, a sharp, ragged sound broke the silence. Garrick Thorne scrambled toward the stone railing, his face flushed with bloodless panic. The performative politeness that had masked his cruelty dissolved in an instant. "It is a forgery!" Garrick shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the leather-bound book. "That wolfless little rat manufactured those numbers. No such trade exists." Alistair did not look up. He simply turned his head slightly. His personal guard, a massive enforcer wearing the silver crest of the sovereign, stepped forward without a word. The guard moved past them, approaching the massive cave beast locked within its fast-hardening dolomite cast. Drawing a heavy iron scraper, the enforcer ran it hard against the armored plating of the beast's left shoulder, scraping away a layer of dried alkaline frost. Beneath the grime, a jagged, chemical burn was seared deep into the hide. The guard pressed wax paper against the brand, rubbing a stick of charcoal over it to lift the exact impression. He walked back with unhurried steps and handed the rubbing to Alistair. The king placed the charcoal rubbing directly beside the red wax seal stamped at the bottom of the ledger's final page. The geometries matched perfectly. The intricate lines of the Ridge Runner Council's private sigil proved the beast sent to kill her was the very same asset logged in the illegal trade records. The ledger was not just a historical document, it was the physical mechanism of their treason. Up in the stands, the silence swallowed Garrick's desperate accusations whole. He stared down at the undeniable proof resting in the king's hands. He did not shout again. The reality of his complete exposure hit him not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, suffocating weight. Garrick's knees gave out. He did not collapse with dramatic flair. He simply lost the mechanical ability to remain standing, sinking heavily onto the damp, mud-slicked steps, the pristine white ceremonial robes he wore, the very fabric, meant to signify his untouchable purity, slumped into a shallow pool of grey alkaline water. The dark, mineral-heavy liquid began creeping up the hem, seeping into the expensive fabric like a dark bruise. He sat there, staring blankly at the ruined silk, shivering. the entire hall oriented toward the ruined elder, watching the hierarchy invert. Lyra looked at the stained robes, feeling the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. She had always known what they were. Now, the rest of the world knew it too. The ledger was heavy in Alistair's hands, as he stood on the mineral-slick floor of the Deep-Crucible, projecting a quiet authority. He let the ink-stained parchment rest against his dark leather gloves, feeling the undeniable weight of a decade's worth of systemic theft contained within its meticulous binding. Up on the mud-slicked steps, Garrick Thorne's face remained drained of all colour. His breaths came in shallow gasps, the sulphur-laced steam clinging to his soiled, embroidered robes like a wet shroud. Harlan stood paralysed beside the collapsed elder, calculating an escape route that no longer existed. Alistair stepped forward, his boots crunching against the cooling dolomite crust that trapped the cave beast, revealing the heavy iron-wrought sovereign signet ring. "By the authority vested in the crown, I strip you of your titles, your land rights, and your seat upon the Ridge Runner Council," Alistair declared, the formal words ringing off the damp limestone walls. He reached out. Not to strike, but to close his hand over the thick silver chains of office draped across Garrick's neck. With a precise twist of his wrist, Alistair pressed the flat edge of his signet ring against the main clasp. The metal groaned and snapped. The sound of the breaking chain was a sharp, metallic click that cut cleanly through the hissing steam. Alistair let the silver links slip from his fingers. The heavy chain plummeted downward, striking the edge of the remaining hydrothermal pool. The highly alkaline, mineral-saturated water ate away at the tarnished silver. It bubbled furiously as the caustic chemical bath dissolved the symbols of Garrick's corrupt authority. The acrid smell of ozone mixed with the damp cave air. Garrick stared at the dissolving metal, his knees finally giving way. He collapsed onto the wet limestone, stripped of everything, while the Omega he had tried to execute stood perfectly composed merely paces away. "Guards," Alistair commanded, his gaze never leaving the broken elder. "Arrest them both for high treason against the pack." The Royal Guard moved immediately, seizing Garrick and Harlan, but it was not the clanking of shackles that shifted the atmospheric pressure of the massive cavern. It was a different sound entirely, beginning high up in the viewing stands. For generations, the lower galleries had been silent. The kitchen staff and the servants knew better than to draw attention to themselves. Remaining unnoticed was their sole defense in a stronghold ruled by predators. Instead, they had watched Lyra freeze a monster with her intellect and a mechanical valve. They had seen the Sovereign King validate her worth and dismantle their oppressors. Cora Miller stood up. The quiet kitchen maid leaned over the rusted iron railing. The remaining council guards gripped their spears, barking at her to sit down, expecting the inherent fear that governed the underclass. Cora did not sit. Her hands, scarred from years of scrubbing stone floors, moved to the heavy knot at the back of her waist. She pulled the coarse string, loosening the thick, stained canvas work apron that marked her servitude. With a deliberate motion, she pulled the apron over her head and tossed it over the edge of the railing. The heavy fabric fell through the steam-filled air, landing on the arena floor with a definitive thud. It was a complete, structural rejection of the hierarchy that had sought to destroy them. A low, resonant cheer broke from Cora's throat, rough and entirely devoid of fear. Beside her, an elderly ledger-keeper unpinned the copper badge from his tunic. A seamstress dropped her binding cloths. A stable hand threw down his leather gloves. The air filled with falling metal as hundreds of low-ranking pack members stood in absolute solidarity. The guards took a step back, their weapons useless against a crowd that refused to be intimidated. The cheering swelled, bouncing off the damp limestone walls, a deafening roar of vindication, driven by the people who held the territory together through invisible labor. Lyra stood in the center of the Deep-Crucible, watching the rain of aprons and badges. A profound warmth settled in her chest, melting the bitter northern cold. Looking up at Cora's fiercely proud face, Lyra realized she had accomplished something far more dangerous. She had proven that the invisible were not powerless. Alistair stepped to her side. He did not command the crowd to be quiet or assert dominance to maintain order. He simply stood beside her, a steady, protective presence offering her the space to witness the systemic collapse of the regime. "They are not cheering for me," Alistair said quietly, his low voice carrying only far enough for her to hear. "No," Lyra agreed, her gaze fixed on the falling aprons, the physical proof of a broken chain. "They are cheering for themselves." The damp cavern air settled into a profound stillness, the lingering echoes of cheering servants fading as the royal guard cleared the lower amphitheatre tiers. The residual moisture from the neutralized geothermal pool clung to the high obsidian walls, dripping slowly onto the mineral-encrusted limestone floor. The sharp, metallic scent of ozone and precipitated dolomite still hung heavy in the enclosed space, a lingering testament to the chemical violence that had just occurred. Alistair Vaughan remained standing before Lyra, the heavy velvet and fur of his sovereign cloak absorbing the cavern's biting chill. He did not step closer to close the physical distance between them. He did not offer a hand to guide her, nor did he project the suffocating pheromones typical of high-ranking alphas attempting to establish dominance over a vulnerable subject. He simply observed her, his posture entirely relaxed, acknowledging the precise, calculated intelligence that radiated from her quiet, unbroken stance. Lyra kept her breathing steady, willing her heart rate to slow. The cold air stung her lungs, but the immediate, visceral threat of the armored cave beast had passed. She watched as the king reached beneath the thick folds of his dark cloak. There was a slow, deliberate quality to his movements, telegraphing his intentions so she would not feel cornered. When his hand emerged, he was not holding a traditional token of royal favor. There was no silver circlet, no gemstone pendant, no heavy signet ring meant to mark a woman as a protected possession of the crown. Instead, he held a small, weathered notebook. The leather cover was cracked along the spine, worn smooth by years of constant tactical handling in harsh northern climates. The faint scent of cedar smoke, dry parchment, and dark iron gall ink emanated from the tightly bound vellum pages. Alistair extended his hand, offering the book to her with the solemnity of a commander, surrendering a crucial weapon to an equal. The Ridge Runner Council has relied on brute force and blind lineage for far too long, the Sovereign said, his voice a low, measured baritone that carried easily through the damp, cavernous space. They forgot that true sovereignty requires structure. It requires the rare ability to read the unseen, underlying mechanics of a territory. Lyra looked down at the offered notebook without reaching for it immediately. The corners of the thick pages were dog-eared, densely covered in tiny meticulous numeric grids and geographic notations. It was his personal ledger of military coordinates, territorial supply lines, and border defense calculations. It was the raw, unpolished brain of his military logistics, completely unprotected, and handed directly to an Omega with no shifting ability. "I am officially dismantling the former council's logistical authority," he continued, his dark eyes fixed entirely on her face. "I require a chief of territorial logistics, a royal security analyst who understands that survival is a matter of correct calibration, not sheer volume. The position requires a mind capable of seeing the complex architecture of a threat long before it arrives at the outer gates." He held the book perfectly steady. He was not rescuing her from the arena. He was hiring the architect who had just conquered it. It was an offer built entirely on the undeniable evidence of her competence, bypassing the pack's rigid biological hierarchy entirely. The gesture held vastly more intimacy than any traditional courtship ritual, recognizing the exact nature of her intellectual worth without asking her to diminish herself to fit a softer, more compliant role. The archivist reached out and took the leather-bound notebook from his palm. The cover was still faintly warm from the ambient heat of his winter coat. She traced the worn binding with her ink-stained thumb, feeling the distinct pressed indentation of a royal seal embedded into the back leather. She did not open it to inspect the confidential coordinates. She let the heavy weight of the book anchor her, running the tactical variables of his employment offer through her mind with the same cold, deliberate precision she had just used to calculate thermodynamic pressure. "If I accept this position," Lyra said, her voice quiet but entirely unbroken by the day's immense physical exhaustion, "the structure of my authority must be absolute within the archives." Alistair tilted his head a fraction of an inch, signaling his willingness to listen. He did not interrupt. He occupied the silence without the nervous, arrogant impulse to fill it, waiting patiently for her non-negotiable conditions. "I will not reside in the royal harem," she stated, defining her physical boundaries with absolute clarity. "I will not accept quarters in the lower servant wings, nor will I be housed in the guest corridors where the unbonded females are traditionally kept for council viewing." She looked up, meeting his steady gaze directly. "I require the high library tower, the one overlooking the northern Pine Ridge. I need sole possession of the upper floors, independent access to the lower vault, and the absolute authority to seal the heavy oak doors against any elder or regional commander who demands entry without my explicit written consent." She was asking for complete physical autonomy, a fortress within his fortress, effectively removing herself from the pack's rigid social hierarchy. She would answer to the ledgers, to the geographical data, and to the sovereign himself, but she would never again be placed in a room where her status could be dictated by an arrogant beta with a loud voice. The king did not hesitate. The faint, knowing smile returned to his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of her strategic foresight. He understood exactly what she was building, a secure, unassailable sanctuary where her intellect could operate entirely without the friction of daily pack politics. "The High Library Tower has been empty for a decade," Alistair answered, his tone cementing the formal agreement. "It is drafty in the northern winter, but the stone is sound, the mahogany shelves remain intact, and the lock on the door is forged from solid cold iron. I will have the iron keys delivered to you before nightfall. No member of the guard will cross that threshold without your expressed permission." Lyra nodded silently, slipping the military notebook deep into the canvas pocket of her work apron. The contract was struck. It required no blood oath, no shifting of forms, and no forced physical proximity. It was a binding, permanent agreement forged over cracked leather, cold stone, and mutual, uncompromising respect. For the first time since she had been dragged into the Deep-Crucible at dawn, the sharp, defensive tension binding her shoulders began to slowly unwind, leaving only the quiet certainty of her own survival. The high court of the sovereign keep smelled of aged parchment, cold iron, and melting beeswax. Tall windows allowed pale northern light to fall across the grand obsidian table. Alistair Vaughan sat at the head of the heavy stone slab, his posture carrying the unhurried grace of a ruler who did not need to shout to be heard. His presence commanded the vast room effortlessly, anchored in an unbothered stillness. Beside him stood Lyra Sterling, no longer a mocked outcast, but the newly appointed chief of territorial logistics. Her dark linen dress was impeccably tailored, moving silently as she leaned forward to review the vellum document laid flat against the stone. It was the official decree of estate restoration. The meticulous calligraphy detailed the immediate return of the ancient Sterling family archives, the northern boundary lands, and the generational wealth that Garrick Thorne's corrupt council had stolen. The ink was still damp, catching the faint glow of the hearth fire, burning at the far end of the drafty hall. Two royal scribes stood waiting in the shadows, watching the Alpha King prepare to make the restoration legally irreversible. A silver melting spoon rested over a small, blue-flamed burner, holding a shallow pool of the standard red pine resin wax traditionally used for royal decrees. Alistair reached for the silver handle, but his fingers paused before making contact. He studied the boiling red liquid, then pushed the burner gently aside. He turned his head toward Lyra, his expression carrying that same quiet, knowing respect he had shown her in the arena gallery. He gestured to the heavy wooden carrying case, resting on the edge of the table, a specialized box containing various binding agents and chemical seals used exclusively in the deepest vaults of the Royal Archive. He asked her to select the sealing compound. The decree needed to survive centuries of archival degradation, remaining immune to the damp chill of the northern winters and the corrosive humidity of the stone vaults. He did not assume command over this final detail. Instead, he deferred the preservation of her legacy entirely to her technical judgment. Lyra opened the wooden case, the brass hinges gliding without a sound. She bypassed the brittle traditional waxes, her ink-stained fingers brushing over delicate glass vials, until she found a dark, viscous synthetic resin mixed with finely crushed basalt. She unstoppered the vial, testing the viscosity against the cold drafts. This compound cured into a rigid waterproof shell, impervious to the slow erosion of time. She poured a careful circle of the dark mixture onto the bottom corner of the vellum page. Alistair lifted the heavy iron royal signet ring from his finger. Without hesitation, he pressed the intricate crest firmly into the cooling black resin. The compound hissed faintly, instantly hardening around the deep iron grooves to form an unbreakable seal. It was a flawless, collaborative execution of authority, a binding contract secured by scientific precision. The air in the high study was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sharp tang of fresh ink. Lyra sat behind a massive oak desk, the polished wood glowing under the light of 3 tallow candles. Outside the glass windows, the evening snow fell in heavy, silent drifts over the Ridge Runner territory, blanketing the dark pine forests in winter white. The hearth fire crackled softly in the corner, radiating a steady warmth that seeped into her bones, chasing away the residual chill of the subterranean caverns she had survived. Her fingers moved steadily over a stack of newly corrected border ledgers, her quill leaving crisp lines of truth across the parchment. There were no false numbers here, no missing shipments, no forged signatures hiding the theft of pack resources. The logistics of the territory were finally operating under the strict mechanics of her architectural mind, bound by mathematics rather than the whims of arrogant elders. She paused her work, setting the quill down carefully on its brass rest, and reached into the deep pocket of her heavy woolen skirt. Her hand emerged, holding a small, jagged mineral fragment. It was a piece of the crystallized dolomite crust, chipped directly from the mineral-encrusted crucible floor on the day of her trial. She held the stone up to the candlelight, observing the pale, porous texture and the faint metallic sheen of the alkaline deposits. It carried no scent of blood, no echo of the beast's snarls, only the dry memory of a thermodynamic equation executed to perfection. The rock was cold, hard, and completely unyielding. She lowered her hand and placed the dolomite fragment gently onto the desk, resting it right next to her heavy brass inkwell. It sat there as a permanent paperweight, anchoring the corners of her geographic maps. It was a physical, undeniable reminder of the trap she had built, a testament to the exact moment her intellectual competence had dismantled an empire of cruelty. Lyra leaned back in her leather chair, letting her gaze drift from the pale mineral stone to the snow-covered landscape beyond the glass. The fortress around her was entirely still. It was not the oppressive quiet of an Omega, trying to remain invisible in the shadow of abusive superiors. It was the deep, structural silence of a sovereign domain, a peace earned through endurance and strategic foresight. She had spent years making herself small to avoid the wrath of elders who despised her lack of a wolf form, swallowing every insult to survive. But sitting here in the warmth of her own estate, with the authority of the realm flowing through her own decisions, she realized the truth. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. It was no longer a desperate shield against the world. It had become the unbreakable foundation of her sovereignty.